Chapter 22 is The Sea Still Rises. And this begins with a personification of Saint Antoine, haggard. Saint Antoine had only one exultant week in which to soften his modicum of hard and bitter bread to such extent as he could, with the relish of fraternal embraces and congratulations, when Madame Defarge sat at her counter as usual, presiding over the customers. So basically, a week has passed, and just notice the personification of the neighborhood. This personification creates a sense of humanity. It just reminds the reader that this is not just a place, but it's a place inhabited by all of the people who are suffering. It says that Madame Defarge wore no rose in her head, for the great brotherhood of spies had become, even in one short week, extremely chatty and trusting of themselves. So they're no longer worried about spies. They feel like they have control of the situation. It goes on to talk about how they're squalid and miserable, but now they have a sense of power. So even though they're still suffering financially, they don't feel so miserable as they used to because they have power. And this is an example of not an actual quote that someone says, but if you can read this here on the side, this is what the peasants are thinking. They're thinking, I know how hard it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to support life in myself. But do you know how easy it has grown for me, the wearer of this, to destroy life in you? So they are empowered by the damage they can do to the aristocracy. Madame Defarge has a suppressed approval as she looks around the wine shop at all the people who are discussing the revolution. She is the leader of the Saint Antoine women. One of her sisterhood knitted beside her, the short, rather plump wife of a starved grocer and the mother of 2 children. This lieutenant had already earned the complimentary name of the Vengeance. So this is a new character. You should make a note of this, the Vengeance. The point of this, vengeance is like, retaliation, revenge. But this also represents something bigger that was happening at the time. During the Revolution, a lot of things were renamed. Certainly people would get names like this, but also landmarks, places in Paris were renamed. One example I have written here on the side is that the Jardin des Tuileries, which is a beautiful square in central London, was renamed during that time of the Jardin des Nationaux, like the National Garden. So just using words like national and revolution in, naming public places just reinforced that change was coming. And then the Vengeance hears somebody coming. Who comes? Well, it's Monsieur Defarge, and he comes in breathless, and he pulls off a red cap. So the red cap was a little woolen cap that all the revolutionaries wore, and he tells everybody in the wine shop to listen. And Madame Defarge says, "Listen," and he says, "Does everybody here recall old Foulon, who told the famished people that they might eat grass, and who died and went to hell?" Now, this is a real person. There was a man, Joseph Francois Foulon, who was a minister, a government minister for the king, which meant he sort of did the king's business for him. And he literally would have been a target during this time. And in order to save himself, he faked his own death. And that's going to be described in the next paragraph. It turns out, though, he's not actually dead. He feared us so much, and with reason, that he caused himself to be represented as dead and had a grand mock funeral, but they have found him alive, hiding in the country, and have brought him in. So in he comes. So of course these peasants are gonna get him. So it's described that Foulon is more than 70 years and 10. So a score is 20 years. So this indicates he's over 70 years old. In fact, at this time, he would have been 74, the actual person that they're describing. He asks everybody if they're ready. And then for this next page and a half, they're going to describe how just riled up these revolutionaries become. The men have terrible, bloody-minded anger. They come pouring into the streets, but the women were a sight to chill. They were the boldest. From such household occupations of their bare poverty yielded from their children, from their aged and their sick crouching on the bare ground, famished and naked, they ran out with streaming hair, urging one another and themselves to madness with the wildest cries and action. Foulon is alive, so they're going to get them. He's the one who told people to eat grass. So when they finally meet him coming in bound as a prisoner, Madame says, see the old villain bound with ropes. That was well done, to tie a bunch of grass on his back. That was well done. Let him eat it. So for 2 or 3 hours, they prepare to kill him, really. It's what they're doing. But first they torture him. Defarge had but sprung over a railing and a table and folded the miserable wretch in a deadly embrace. So Monsieur Defarge attacks Foulon. Madame Defarge has but followed and turned her hand in one of the ropes with which he was tied. The Vengeance and Jacques III were not yet up with them, and the men at the windows had not yet swooped into the hall, like birds of prey from their high perches, when the cry seemed to go up all over the city, bring him out, bring him to the lamp. So when they bring him out into the streets, bunches of grass are thrust into his mouth to make him suffer the way that the people suffered. And Madame Defarge finally lets him go, as a cat might have done to a mouse, and silently and composedly looked at him while they made ready and while he besought her. Like, I'm sure he's like pleading with her, please don't hurt me, which of course is not the case. So they string him up to hang him. When they hang him, the ropes break twice. So that's an important detail that you might get quizzed on. Finally, the rope holds and he is killed, and then they cut his head off and put it on a pike with grass in his mouth, and then they carry him through the streets of Saint Antoine. But there's more to do. They also discover before the end of the day that Foulon's son-in-law has also been discovered. He was also an enemy, obviously, because he was related. And he's coming in under a guard of 500 in cavalry alone. So another person is coming in. So not long before dark night did the men and women come back to the children. So after all this torture and killing, the peasants go back to Saint Antoine. They go to the miserable baker shops, and they get in long lines to buy bread for their dinner. And gradually, these strings of ragged people shortened and frayed away, and then poor lights began to shine in high windows, and slender fires were made in the streets. So there's a metaphor here, strings of ragged people shortened and frayed. Afterwards, supping at their doors. So they go back and they have their simple suppers. And what's interesting here is just another reference, just like in the beginning of the chapter, that even though they're suffering, they don't feel so terrible anymore. It says, fathers and mothers who had their full share in the worst of the day played gently with their meager children, and lovers with such a world around them and before them loved and hoped. So this is juxtaposing the suffering with the warmth, showing that there's like a little bit of humanity coming back into these people. It was almost morning when Defarge's wine shop parted with its last knot of customers. This reference to a knot of customers reminds me of Madame Defarge knotting up the coins in her handkerchief and banging them on the table. And Monsieur Defarge says to his wife, "At last it has come, my dear." So he's so happy. It's like the revolution is here, and of course he's living to see it. Saint Antoine slept, the Defarges slept, even the Vengeance slept with her starved grocer. I keep wondering about this. I'm wondering if he's starved. She was described as overweight. I'm wondering if she's eating all the groceries. It just made me wonder, how is she so well fed and he is not, and he's selling food? And the drum was at rest. The drum was the only voice in Saint Antoine that blood and hurry had not changed. The Vengeance, as custodian of the drum, could have wakened him up and had the same speech out of him as before the Bastille fell or old Foulon was seized. Not so with the hoarse tones of the men and women in Saint Antoine's bosom. So the Vengeance is the keeper of the drum. She's the one who bangs the drum when it's time to go and kill more aristocrats. So these are some important details. The main thing here, our new character is the Vengeance and Foulon. You want to know who those two people are. Then the next chapter is describing what's happening in the country. So all this was happening in Paris. Fire Rises is describing what happened out in the country. And what was happening out in the countryside is there were agents of destruction, individual revolutionaries or small groups of revolutionaries setting houses on fire. This actually happened. It was called the Great Fear. It was the burning of chateaus. It happened for about 2 weeks once the Bastille fell. So that's what's being described here, and it opens with the mender of roads. He's back in the little village of was near the Monsieur the Marquis's home. He goes forth daily to hammer out the stones in the highway. So he's working on the road. He can see the prison still up there in the hill. And there's a description here. This actually is Dickens himself, sort of making a political reflection. He talks about how Monseigneur was a title that described like proper people. Remember in the beginning of this book, we had Monsieur in the country, we had Monseigneur in the city who was taking his chocolate. These were aristocracy had the potential to be like good for society if they had actually, if they were a polite example of a shining life, if they did create, goodness through their wealth. But that is not what happened. So it's sort of just a reflection on that possibility, which of course did not occur. So this was not the change on the village and on many villages like it. For scores of years gone by, Monseigneur had squeezed it and wrung it and had seldom graced it with his presence, except for the pleasures of the chase. So it's like what actually happened is these Monseigneurs, these proper men, exploited these people instead of helping them. So the mender of roads is working, and all of a sudden, a rough figure approaches on foot. He's described as shaggy-haired, and he has wooden shoes. Now, this is another new character. We never get a name for this person, but he is an example of one of these men that was out to burn the chateau. So he's one of these agents of destruction. So such a man came upon him, the mender of roads, like a ghost at noon in the July weather, as he sat on his heaps of stones under the bank, taking shelter. So he's just taking a break, and apparently it's also hailing, so the weather is terrible. So the mender of roads is taking a moment to ride out the bad weather. And they talk to each other. How goes it, Jacques? All well, Jacques. So clearly these two know they're each revolutionaries. And this man, dirty man with the wooden shoes, lights his pipe and then drops a little something in it, which makes it flame. And so that flaming is a symbol to the mender of roads that he's there to do some burning. And the mender of roads says, tonight? And the man says, yes. And he says, where? The mender of roads asks where, and the man says here, like he's going to burn here, which would be the chateau of the Marquis. Show me, said the traveler. So he wants to know where is Monsieur the Marquis's chateau. And the mender of roads says, oh, you're going to go down here, straight through the street, past the fountain. And the man says, no, he's not going to walk through the middle of town. He's going to be going over the landscape. He's going to walk off the road through the countryside. So the mender of roads says it's about 2 leagues, generally that direction. And the man who's going to do the burning asks the mender of roads how long he'll be working on the roads. And he says, well, until sunset. And so he asks the mender of roads to wake him when he finishes working, because he has walked 2 nights without resting, and he needs a nap before he burns the chateau. So the man finishes his pipe, takes off his great wooden shoes, and lays down on a bunch of stones and falls asleep. And then the mender of roads is sitting alone and just thinking about what's happening. He wore a red cap now in place of his blue one. So remember that the mender of roads, who's described as the little man, had a blue cap when he visited the Defarges, and saw the king and queen. He also had a blue cap when he told the Marquis that a man had been under his carriage. Now he wears a red one, so he is officially a revolutionary. Here are a bunch of details that could show up on a quiz. The mender of roads sits and looks at this sleeping man, and he's inspired by what he's going to do. He says the traveler had traveled far, and his feet were footsore, and his ankles chafed and bleeding, and his great shoes, stuffed with leaves and grass, had been heavy to drag over the many leagues, and his clothes were chafed into holes, as he himself was into sores. Stooping down beside him, the road mender tried to get a peep at secret weapons in his breast, or where not, but in vain, for he slept with his arms crossed upon him and set as resolutely to his lips. So it says here that there were many other men like him. He saw in his small fancy similar figures stopped by no obstacle, tending to centers all over France. And so this did happen, that individual men like this one got together in small groups and went to the countryside. And this was called the Great Fear, and it lasted for about 2 weeks after the fall of the Bastille. So finally, it's time for the mender of roads to stop working. He wakes up the man with the wooden shoes, and off he leaves to go towards the chateau. And the mender of roads goes home. When he gets to the fountain, he sees lean kine. This is probably not a word you've ever seen before. It means cows who were brought to the well to drink in the center of town. And then it says, when the village had taken its poor supper, it did not creep to bed as it usually did, but came out of doors again and remained there. A curious contagion of whispering was upon it, and also when it gathered together at the fountain in the dark. Another curious contagion of looking expectantly at the sky in one direction only. So they're anticipating the burning. Monsieur Gabelle, chief functionary of the place, became uneasy. Now remember, he was the tax collector for Monsieur the Marquis, and he's been hiding in a sort of fortified stone room where he won't get hurt. He's afraid he's vulnerable, as he certainly is to this peasants. He becomes uneasy. He went out on his housetop alone and looked in that direction too, glanced down from behind his chimneys at the darkening faces by the fountain, and sent word to the sacristan who kept the keys of the church that there might be need to ring the tocsin by and by. So this is a bell that would be rung if there was a fire. So he's anticipating this too. It references here the rain ran wildly. So this is another reference to revolutionaries in terms of just a metaphor. There's a lot of water references for the revolutionaries, the sea and the waves, and in this case, the running rain. And then through the woods, 4 heavy treading, unkempt figures crushed the high grass. So the man with the wooden shoes is joined by 3 others, and they are approaching the chateau. Presently, the chateau began to make itself strangely visible by some light of its own, so it has been set afire. Flames burst forth, and the stone faces awakened, stared out of fire. So remember that Dickens keeps using these stone faces to mirror like the feelings of the aristocracy. So this is, again, them sort of having a reaction to this. A faint murmur arose about the house from the few people who were left there. So these would have been the Marquis's servants. And there was a saddling of a horse and a riding away. There was spurring and splashing through the darkness, and bridle was drawn in the space by the village fountain, and the horse in a foam stood at Monsieur Gabelle's door. Help, Gabelle, help everyone. So the person, one of the people who was still living in the chateau, goes to Gabelle's door in the church because he figures maybe he's like, one of his, he's maybe a safe person because he's also part of the aristocracy to some degree. So he calls everyone to help. The bell is ringing for the fire. Help, gentlemen, officers, the chateau is on fire. Gabelle never answers his door when the man on the horse asks people to go and put the fire out because there are, valuable objects there. The firemen say it must burn because they know that if they try to get involved, they could get killed. The mender of roads and the 250 friends, inspired as one man and woman by the idea of lighting up, had darted into their houses and were putting candles in every dull little pane of glass. So these are all the villagers who are inspired by Monsieur and Madame Defarge. They know what's happening in Paris. The mender of the roads, once so submissive to authority, had remarked that carriages were good to make bonfires with and that post horses would roast. So he's kind of coming out on his own. He's like, yeah, I'm a revolutionary. Let's burn the carriages. Let's burn the horses. So again, with the rising and the falling of the blaze, the stone faces showed as if they were in torment. The face with the two dints in the nose became obscured, as if it were the face of the cruel Marquis burning at the stake. So again, the stone faces are having, expressions that would be sort of similar to how the aristocracy would feel. Then these four men who had set the chateau on fire head in each different directions, east, west, north, and south, towards their next destination. Not only that, but the village, lightheaded with famine, fire, and bell ringing, and bethinking itself that Monsieur Gabelle had to do with the collection of rent and taxes, became impatient for an interview with him. So of course they're like, let's get Gabelle. He's the one who was taking all our money, and Gabelle is, I'm sure, terrified of this idea. So Monsieur Gabelle did heavily bar his door and retire to hold counsel with himself. He decided that if anyone broke in, he was going to jump out and land on the street and kill people as he fell to his death. He's like not going to be taken by these people. A trying suspense to be passing a whole summer night on the brink of a black ocean, ready to take that plunge into which upon Monsieur Gabelle had resolved. But it turns out that morning comes and he has made it through the night without being captured or approached, or no one tried to break into his little room. There were other villagers and townspeople less fortunate than the mender of roads, and this is saying that in some other places where they had set fire, sometimes the aristocrats actually captured the revolutionaries and killed them. But in this particular village where the mender of roads lives, they were able to drive the remaining aristocrats out. So here are your other new characters. The man with the wooden shoes, he set the chateau on fire with 3 other men. Gabelle fears he will be killed by the townspeople, and this is referring to an actual historical event called the Fear that went from about July 20th to August 6th after the Bastille had fallen. And this is when small groups of revolutionaries went across the countryside, burning homes that belonged to aristocrats.